Hi, Amy. This question for you. It was a really great presentation, and I think showcased the utility of Flatiron's approach and similar approaches for looking at outcome data um, and drug utilization. I'm interested in enrichment studies, and I'm curious to understand how what your vision is um, for reaching out into the community in real time to physicians and to patients, and creating a real-time database of patients that can be utilized in that setting. Also for really incorporating biological data on a much larger scale to make that possible.
So the question was around enrichment studies, and I see this as a series of approaches. So right now, the first thing we've done is work towards enriching with currently available data sets. So in fact, I was looking last night at the combination of the clinical genomics registry. So for example, Foundation Medicine plus processed electronic health record data. So I think that's like the first step. The second step is certainly, as you've alluded to, the ability to um, essentially combine EHR data with prospective data capture in some way. And that's something that at least we're actively working on, and I suspect other groups are too. And I anticipate that we'll start to see that come into play at the end of 2016. One of the cool things about being a tech company is I now talk in quarters. So, sort of into 2016. And I think that that's where this space is going. Then, there's the next step, which is that we already have a lot of tissue that's already, in place. It may be paraffin embedded, but it is in place because it's been collected as a routine part of care. And being able to understand and think through what does the consent look like in the routine way in the community, and be able to match into that and access that tissue is, I think, the next step. And then after that, it's sort of thinking about even more sophisticated biospecimens, and so sort of serial rolling those things out. I expect that we need to have the whole community coming together. So it's the scientists, it's the community oncologists, it's the academic oncologists, it's the patients, it's the tech community, et cetera, really trying to coordinate this in a thoughtful way. Yeah, anything?
I think once you make it easier to take clinical data and make it available for research, it frees up your resources to add in other things. And the easier you can make it to transfer the data from the point of care into a research database, the more things you can think about doing.
I mean, one of my biggest questions around this is how much of this is going to happen pre-competitively versus competitively, because there are huge competitors in this space. But really, we're talking about data sharing and sharing information on clinical genomic databases. That's very much a pre-competitive type of activity that we're trying to encourage at a policy level. So I'm curious about sort of how that's going to play out in terms of those competing interests in the space.
What do I think about this one a lot? So the question was about, how do we think about data sharing in the pre-competitive space, considering the fact that we've got both public and private entities also working in that same space. I think ultimately we've got several things that we've got to tackle. So one is interoperability, and interoperability really is fundamentally the question about moving information back and forth, including APIs, electronic health records, et cetera, which has to happen, period, including the fact that I think every EHR has got to tackle this. And I know specifically within Flatiron, this is a daily conversation, if not an hourly conversation at times, is solving for this. But it's not as simple as it seems, but it has to be solved. Second is that we have to recognize that it costs money to do this no matter which way you look at it. So at the end of the day, if we want to have something that is enduring, we have to figure out the business models to make that happen. So if we can put that on the table and say it costs money and we've got to figure out the business models, then the other part of putting that on the table is to say, but we all actually are trying to get to the same thing. The third piece is actually really, it's not so much about the data, and I hope that's what the immuno-oncology meeting is here to say. It's what Mary pointed out. It's the ability to do clinical trials and the ability to use the data for a variety of things, everything from improving healthcare delivery to improving discovery sciences. And so that actually is one of the things that we need to also get together on in a pre-competitive way.
I agree with everything you say, particularly the fact that it costs a lot of money, and that. But I think that there's some policy implications for this in terms of requiring certain functionalities of these systems that will make collaboration easier and not more difficult. Interoperability is key. Functionality so that data can be easily exported for analysis is key. But we also have to pay attention to things like if you say being able to use specimens, we have to pay attention to how we consent patients. Because unless you have consented a patient in the correct way, that specimen is going to be useless to you, even if you know where it is and who it's from. So there are those kinds of things as well.
Really good session, Amy. Thank you so much. So I have a couple of things to feedback. First, on this question of interoperability, in the community of consumer and patient advocates that I operate in, this drives them nuts. And they look at this question from a perspective of really extreme frustration, which is that data is about me and it belongs to me. And therefore, I should have the ability to send it forth to do good. And the walls of various types that have been built around it to prevent that free flow of data can send those of us who work on these issues very quickly into a state of practically foaming at the mouth. Next, actually directly related to that, for Dr. Horowitz, and this is a session on collaboration. So I hear and I sympathize with what you said about making research use a meaningful use thing. We should talk about how you could do that in a collaborative way with the patient and consumer groups who very, very, very closely monitor any suggested changes to meaningful use, because they fought very hard to get that into the legislation and the description in the regulations, and they do not trust, especially the hospital systems, to act in good faith when it comes to making any changes in that regulation.
That's a really...
So we should talk about that.
Yeah, and I have to tell you that on our... We do have patient advocates who are working together with us on some of these issues, including trying to get research included in meaningful use. I mean, I'm not saying that the things in meaningful use are bad. It's just they're very limited.
Yeah, you know, that there's a reason for that, and it's not a happy reason. Okay, and then last to Dr. Averbush, you know, it was actually a relief to hear you reference the HER2 example as something to be avoided with this work, because that was not a happy story, frankly. And I mean, I don't think anybody foresaw long ago with Herceptin that was all going to unfold that way. But the encouraging thing is that the field has actually apparently learned from that. Because, as you said, if the patients and clinicians trying to make decisions can't trust the test, this is not good. As a patient, I say that.
Yeah, well, thank you for our comments. And that clearly was a driver. I mean, we recognize that, you know, we all have to learn from the past, and we have to continue, you know, really pay attention to continuous improvement on how we approach these problems. And I hope that that's, you know, one example of how we can do this. And I think it's relevant to the other comments that we heard as well. There has to be a general will to do this among the constituents, and then we can accomplish it.
This may be a little naive because informatics is not my expertise, but it seems that if you're trying to extract data from an electronic medical record, that laboratory data, which is usually quantified, is easy to handle because databases handle numbers very well. But how do you deal with things like physician notes with conventional history and physical and things like that, where you often have very descriptive things that are not so easily quantifiable and handled as numbers in a large database?
It's a great question. So a couple things. The lab is actually really easy if you're in the lab. They tend to use a different system, a lab information management system like a LIMS, and there it's just numbers. They then compile that into a document, a PDF, and sends it to the medical record. So they actually take data that's simply and really well-structured, organized data you should be able to mine, and it ends up in an EHR as text, more or less, or unstructured data. So it matters on where the data is being processed. That's one. And there are lots of things that are going on with all different things to extract data out of text. So it's actually doable. I think it's more a matter of what's the return on doing that a lot of the times. How helpful is that content versus some of the other content that you're going through?
I mean, if it's numbers already, you can extract the numbers out of a PDF. But if it's more qualitative assessment of a physician doing a physical exam or taking a history, what I'm afraid is that one could lose a lot of important information that's been important in medicine if we sort of squeeze everything into some things that are quantifiable as numbers, like lab data, which, diagnosis is going more and more toward lab data and not looking at the patient.
So 2 comments about this. We have a wonderful and elegant history in this country called the Tumor Registry system, including the Ford's Manual that gives very detailed guidelines to tumor registrars about how to turn, for example, information in the medical record into detailed variables. And what's remarkable is that there can be very consistent processing and movement from the documents into specific variables that are consistent. So that's the first piece, is that we actually do have a history there. The second thing is that it's interesting that you can spend a lot of time and a lot of very careful work, but in fact generate variables that are very meaningful. So for example, one of the things that we've been working on is a variable around progression. And starting off with the clinical mental model of how doctors think about whether or not the disease has gotten worse, and then moving that into a set of policies and procedures that can be translated, you actually can get to a variable that is sort of an anatomic variable consistent with progression, but that ultimately it's important to think through what was the doctoring or the clinical activity that was happening, and then how does that translate to the variable, and then teaching people policies and procedures of how to read through that. The last piece to this is that there's going to be an entirely new vocabulary, I expect, about how people think about variables that have come from abstracted data, because ultimately we have to think about how do those variables perform compared to other similar variables that you would think would act in a consistent manner. And we have to actually understand the confidence interval about using that particular variable and how does that translate into our analyses. And I suspect that if we use the world of patient-reported outcomes, it will actually give us a mental model to how we think about these variables that are somewhat subjective for objective context.
I have to say, we already do that.
Yeah.
We actually already do that, because when we are analyzing the results of a clinical trial, or whether it's a clinical trial or an outcomes registry, someone is making the judgment of how to take that information from the physical exam and put it in a box. Now, sometimes it's like forcing a square hole into a round peg. That's true, but we make those judgments, and I think that what technology is allowing us to do is systematize how we make that translation. I think one of the most important things that Amy said is that you have to have disease experts. You have to have you have to have people who understand the disease and the patients and how we assess them be a part of the process of developing those algorithms, and then you have to test to see if they worked. And you have to keep testing to see how they worked. And then we will get better and better at that, just like some research coordinators get better and better at understanding what performance score is, or how to grade graft versus host disease, or how to grade scleroderma, or whatever. We're making those assessments now. Now we're trying to do it in a more systematic, somewhat easier way, but it's expensive.
So, Steve, just one more question related to the blueprint effort. I'm curious, has there been any discussion about looking at other histologies within the group, in particular with the reality that, when we're comparing to HER2 breast cancer, you were looking at one histology that took actually a lot of effort. Here, PD-L1 status at this point is helping decide whether or not some people are giving patients nivolumab and ipilimumab right now, but there's not really standardization that's potentially available for melanoma amongst other histologies that might actually end up with approvals very soon.
So we've had very preliminary discussions around that. I think we're going to have to just see where it goes. I think, personally, I think that for this, I don't know if the blueprint in itself will be a sustainable force to do this, but I think that it provides a springboard for now the professional societies to take on the same remit, whether it's an ASCO CAP or AMP or I think that's really where it needs to get into. We can debate how much of this needs to be regulated or non-regulated. I would be advocating that that's the professional societies that should set the standards and take from the blueprint, I think, a paradigm to take this forward for other histologies.
Steve, during the process of actually doing this, I'm sure lots of issues came up from the different companies that might be an impediment that were at least worked out or ironed out, etc. What are the major issues that you think they were the impediment, and how in the future can be ironed out to be able to do more of this work?
Samira, I think surprisingly, and I'm looking at Rasika also for her, and she may want to comment, I think remarkably few barriers and issues came up. I think we were all fairly united in trying to get this done. And we saw collectively, that, it was happening anyway.
So why didn't it happen
and therefore, I
before?
think we felt that there was a genuine imperative to just work through the issues in a highly collaborative way.
So the question is, it hadn't happened before because it wasn't organized, or?
Yeah.
Sure.
So I'm going to jump in here. I think this was a unique situation. When we started the collaborative, as Steve mentioned, none of the products had been approved, the therapeutics or the diagnostics. There was clearly a need because we had seen the history with HER2, and with PD-L1, the story was even more complex. The folks, who were part of the team, the drug companies, the pharma companies, were all neck and neck when it came to product development. And so it was almost a perfect alignment of the stars. People recognized the need. There wasn't one product that was, in preclinical and one that was in phase 3. They were all almost approximately at the same level of development. The diagnostic partners had been identified. The IUO assays were clearly defined. This wasn't one case of a biomarker being defined, the other not. And so I think that was one of the reasons why this was a good project. People have asked me several times, what do you think is the key for success? And the key for success is you have to identify a project that has a clear scope, which is another thing that contributed to the success. We didn't say, and this is going back to Elad's question, yes, we could have done this in, everything from melanoma to lung to ovarian. Now it's going on in so many things, but we said we're going to focus on one disease because otherwise it would have been everything. And the other issue was it was only IO assays, not LDTs, because again, the scope would just become gargantuan and we wouldn't have accomplished anything. So I think that was the main thing. And keeping in mind the focus that it's about doing the right thing for the patients and to avoid confusion at the clinic. It was always about the patient, and that's what kept everybody together.
Thank you, Rasika. Well said.
So this is for Eric. Okay, you guys have mentioned a couple times the importance of domain knowledge in being able to make sense of this. So I'm addressing this to you as a data scientist. Isn't that important about any data set in order to make sense of it?
It's actually real important. So it's a great question, Mark. A couple things to think of. First of all, if you think of a patient encounter for just a second, right? It can be in a case report form or it could be an entry in EMR. They're hugely different because the case report form in clinical research is tied to a protocol, so there's an expectation of what should go on, what's going to happen, what happened before, what happened after, right? So you look at that EHR visit as some of the examples have changed. If people got part of their care somewhere else, it's a discontiguous story. So that's one thing that I think I often tell people, that I actually think EHR systems more like retail management systems. They're originally designed to be billing systems. They really were. And so, that's like, me being able to go to, Sports Authority and have them work on my backhand for me. They have no idea based on what I bought there. So I think the idea of understanding the domain knowledge is huge. And I think one of the things that I should have said, I know Amy said, and I know this really takes humans. Even as good as the technology is now, having really smart folks in the mix, you don't need a ton of them. You just need the right ones at the right place. Is actually hugely important to get meaningful knowledge out of these things. And I think it takes a human. Not that if I'm an IT guy, I'm actually a human too. But anyway, it's just real important. So the domain knowledge is huge, and I think getting folks in the mix that speak these different languages, that understand the different technologies that come in, because even in geneticists don't necessarily talk with some of the clinicians, et cetera. I talk about this and say that, everyone that I know young that's coming into my company, biology is now being taught as a quantitative and computer science. It wasn't when I went to school, but it is now. And so I think we're naturally addressing these things as they go, but for now, we're going to need people to translate.
Okay, so thank you very much for a great day. I would like to thank all the speakers. We will wrap up a lot tomorrow because we have a morning session where we're having a 5th session tomorrow. And then we will have a panel to talk about value and the value of immune therapy and how we go about it. And that would really wrap up lots of the discussion that we had today. As for now, you are invited all to the 3rd floor for a reception. And I think there are some drinks if some of you need that at this stage. So thank you very much. Thanks.